A hand brushes dust from a curve of bone no bigger than a walnut. It is a skull. An infant skull, pressed into red ochre-stained earth for thousands of years, its fontanelle the soft, unfused gap at the crown still faintly visible in the fossilized plates. Someone knelt here once, long before writing, before cities, before anything we would call medicine. Someone arranged this tiny body with care, not haste, care. That single detail should stop you cold. An infant this fragile, in a world this brutal, was buried like it mattered. So here is the question everyone asks. Did ancient humans have doctors for babies? But that's the easy version. The real question is stranger and more uncomfortable. In a world without antibiotics, without sterile tools, without the faintest idea of what a virus even was, how did any human infant survive long enough to grow up at all? And who, exactly, was keeping them alive? The short answer is yes, something like pediatric care existed almost as long as humans have. But it wasn't practiced in a clinic. It was practiced by an entire community, and the evidence for it is written directly into the bones. Start with the numbers, because they're brutal. In most prehistoric populations we can study, somewhere between a third and half of all children died before reaching adulthood. Infancy itself was the deadliest stretch of the whole human lifespan. That statistic alone tells a story. A species that loses this many young cannot afford carelessness. Evolution does not reward carelessness, it punishes it, ruthlessly, generation after generation. So something had to counteract that loss. Anthropologists call it cooperative breeding, the idea that human infants, unlike almost every other primate, are raised not by the mother alone, but by a wide network of caregivers, grandmothers, older siblings, aunts, sometimes unrelated adults in the same band. This wasn't sentimentality, it was survival math. A human infant is born almost helpless, with a brain still years from maturity, requiring an enormous, sustained investment of calories and attention. One mother, alone, foraging and nursing and defending against predators, simply could not do it all. Which means, from a certain angle, humanity's very first medical system wasn't a person, it was a structure. But here's where it gets messy. Cooperative care sounds warm and tidy in a lecture hall. In the actual archaeological record, it's anything but tidy. We don't have journals from Paleolithic mothers. We don't have prescriptions carved into stone. What we have are fragments of bone here, a burial there, a healed fracture, a tooth with a growth defect frozen mid-formation. Piecing together ancient pediatric care from this is a little like reconstructing an entire symphony from 3 surviving notes. And the deeper complication is this. Survival isn't proof of care. A child could survive by luck. A child could die despite intense care. The bones can tell us what happened to a body. They almost never tell us why, what someone was thinking, feeling, or trying to do, as they knelt beside a sick child in the dark. That's the tension running under this entire investigation. We are reading intention from silence. Here's where one particular discovery changes the shape of the conversation entirely. At a Paleolithic-era burial site in what is now Italy, a rock shelter used by hunter-gatherer communities roughly 10,000 years ago, archaeologists uncovered the remains of an infant girl, buried with extraordinary care. Around her body, over 60 pierced shell beads, 4 pendants, and an eagle-owl talon, arranged as though sewn onto clothing that had long since disintegrated. Ochre stained the soil around her. This infant lived only a matter of weeks, and yet someone in her community spent hours, maybe days, crafting and attaching dozens of tiny ornaments to bury with her. Picture that labor. Someone drilling shell after shell with a stone point, by firelight, for a child who would never walk or speak. That is not the behavior of a species that treated infant death as unremarkable. That is grief, ritualized into permanence. So if the emotional evidence is this strong, what does the medical evidence actually look like? Layer by layer, it builds into something remarkable. First layer, bone growth records. Long bones, particularly the shins and thighs of infant skeletons, grow in visible increments, something like tree rings. When illness, starvation, or trauma interrupts that growth, it leaves a mark, a thin, dense line called a Harris line, or pitting in the bone surface known as parodic hyperostosis, often linked to anemia or chronic infection. Many ancient infant skeletons carry these lines, proof of survived crises, not fatal ones. A body that records an illness and then keeps growing is a body that was fed, warmed, and nursed back from the edge. Second layer, teeth. Enamel, once formed, never remodels. It's the most honest witness the body keeps. Defects called enamel hypoplasia, thin grooves across a tooth's surface mark, exact windows of physiological stress in early childhood. Researchers can sometimes date these grooves almost to the month. And crucially, many individuals who carry these scars lived on, sometimes for decades. The crisis passed. Someone got them through it. Third layer, healed trauma. Fractures that mended crookedly but mended nonetheless. A skull with evidence of a depression injury that shows bone remodeling around the wound, meaning the child lived weeks, months, years afterward. Bone doesn't lie about survival. Something or someone allowed that survival to happen. Fourth layer, material culture. Small tools, cradle boards, worn grinding stones associated with soft, pre-chewed food residues, all suggesting deliberate infant feeding practices distinct from adult diets. Weaning, it turns out, has a much older material footprint than most people assume. Fifth layer, and the highest stakes one, cross-cultural consistency. This pattern survived stress, healed injury, ritualized burial, doesn't appear in just one site or one culture. It echoes across continents, across tens of thousands of years, in populations that never had contact with each other. That's not coincidence. That's a behavior baked deep into the species. Here's the strange part. None of these people had a word for pediatrician. And yet, independently, again and again, human groups built the same invisible safety net around their youngest. Now, one piece of this puzzle remains genuinely contested, and a good storyteller doesn't hide that. Some of the ornate infant burials, like the shell-covered child described earlier, have sparked real debate. One interpretation: the elaborate burial reflects deep, universal parental grief, no different in kind from what any parent today would feel. The opposing interpretation, held by other researchers, such elaborate treatment might reflect the infant's inherited social status, meaning not all infants in that community were mourned or resourced equally. Both readings are defensible. Both are supported by partial evidence. And honestly, we may never fully resolve it. What we can say, with confidence, is only this: at least some infants, in at least some ancient communities, received care and mourning of extraordinary intensity. What we cannot say is whether that intensity was universal or a privilege. For tens of thousands of years, this is all indirect evidence: bones, teeth, beads, silence. But then, something changes. Writing arrives. And suddenly, for the first time, the evidence stops whispering and starts speaking. In ancient Egyptian medical papyri dating back roughly 3,500 years, there are explicit instructions for treating infants, remedies for coughing, feeding difficulties, even what appears to be an early description of something resembling colic. In ancient Mesopotamian texts, incantations exist specifically invoked over sick children, alongside practical instructions: keep the infant warm, keep the infant fed, watch the fever. This is the reveal buried inside the historical record itself. The prehistoric evidence had been hinting at something all along. And now, for the first time, we get to hear ancient people describe it in their own words. The instincts etched into bone for millennia finally get written down as instructions.
Suddenly someone cared for this child becomes here is exactly how. And here's where the story loops forward in a way that should genuinely surprise you. Modern isotopic analysis, a technique that measures chemical signatures locked into ancient bone, and teeth can now reconstruct an individual's exact weaning timeline, sometimes narrowed down to specific months of infancy. When researchers ran this analysis on remains from multiple ancient populations, the weaning patterns they found were remarkably close to breastfeeding and weaning windows recommended by modern pediatric health organizations today. Let that sit for a second. A technology born in 21st century laboratories just confirmed that hunter-gatherers, tens of thousands of years ago, were on average feeding their infants on a timeline that current medical science still considers close to ideal. They didn't have that science. They had something else. Generations of trial, observation, and inherited memory, passed mouth to ear, caregiver to caregiver, long enough to encode itself into practice. But, and this matters enormously, none of this means every ancient infant received the same care, or that ancient infant care was one single, uniform thing. Think about parenting today. Somewhere right now, an infant is being raised by attentive, well-resourced caregivers with instant access to medical advice. Somewhere else, in the very same city, another infant is being raised under real strained poverty, isolation, lack of support. Same species, same era, wildly different outcomes. Ancient populations were no different. Skeletal evidence shows real inequality. Some infants carry the marks of chronic malnutrition and repeated crisis. Others show almost none. Some communities appear to have had dense, resource-rich support networks. Others appear to have been stretched painfully thin. Treating ancient humans as one monolithic parenting culture erases exactly the kind of variation the evidence actually shows. Two dimensions of this story tend to get overlooked entirely. First, the role of older children themselves. In many hunter-gatherer societies studied by anthropologists, young children, sometimes as young as 6 or 7, actively participated in infant care, carrying, soothing, feeding, watching. Pediatric caregiving, in other words, wasn't strictly an adult institution. It was, in part, a child-run one. Second, and more subtle, the emotional labor of anticipatory grief. In populations with such high infant mortality, caregivers were, in a very real sense, providing intensive care while braced for loss. That psychological weight leaves no bone marker, no artifact. It is the most human part of this entire story, and it is also the part the archaeological record can never fully recover. Now layer in the sheer physical reality of the environment itself. No refrigeration, no clean water guaranteed, no climate control against a freezing night or a scorching one. Every single caregiving decision when to move camp, when to nurse, when to isolate a sick child from others carried survival stakes for the entire group, not just the infant. Ancient caregiving wasn't a private, individual choice. It was logistics, embedded inside the group's collective survival strategy. A sick infant wasn't just a family's private worry in a small enough band. It was a shared problem, because everyone's fate was interlinked. And this is where the ancient and the modern quietly fold into each other. We still do this today. Every it takes a village cliche. Every grandmother who shows up uninvited with soup. Every neighborhood group chat trading advice about a feverish toddler at 2 a.m. That's cooperative infant care, running on the exact same evolutionary software installed tens of thousands of years ago. We just don't recognize the ancient machinery humming underneath the modern behavior. Care isn't kindness. It's infrastructure. And infrastructure this old doesn't disappear, it just changes its costume. Which brings us to something larger than infant medicine at all. Every human generation, in every era, has faced the same terrifying fact, that our young begin life completely unable to protect themselves. And every human generation has answered that fact the same way, not with a single hero, not with a lone genius, but with a network. Grandmothers, neighbors, strangers who become family out of necessity. Maybe that's the oldest medicine of all. Not a herb, not a technique, a person willing to show up for another person's child. So did ancient humans have baby doctors? Not in the way we mean the phrase today. There was no diploma, no clinic, no single specialist. But there was something arguably more powerful. An entire community functioning as a distributed, ever-present pediatric support system, one written not into any surviving text, but directly into the bones of the children it kept alive. Return, for a moment, to that infant skull pressed into red ochre earth, its fontanelle still faintly visible after thousands of years. We now know that gap in the skull wasn't just anatomy. It was a metaphor no one intended to leave behind, a soft, unfinished space, built to be protected by something outside itself. That's the larger truth this whole story was really about. Humanity's oldest survival technology was never a tool you could hold. It was a circle of people, arranged around the most fragile among them, refusing to let the gap go unguarded. The bones remembered what history forgot, and what they remembered was this. Before we had medicine, we had each other. And in the end, that may be the only treatment that has never stopped working.